Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Israel's entry into Egypt in our continuing study of the book of Genesis. The Joseph narrative had started with the hatred that Joseph's brothers had for him, and it led them to plot against him and ultimately to sell him into slavery. And we turn the page after that as he's sold down to Egypt, and instead we read of a story of Judah. And Judah is doing some things he shouldn't be doing, intermarrying with the Canaanites, and there's this girl Tamar who marries one of his sons, but then those sons die. And at the end of the story, Judah has been he's actually he's gone in with her, taken his daughter-in-law without his realizing who she was, had children by her who are going to be specially blessed and be a special part of that seed leading all the way ultimately down to Messiah. And so there's a hint already that Judah is being signified as the leader. Now, the camera comes back to Joseph. He's a slave in Egypt, and he's falsely accused by the wife of Potiphar, and so he goes from being a slave to being a prisoner, and cast into prison as a slave. But then, after he's come into contact with the Pharaoh's butler and baker, and then a few more years pass, he comes to the attention of the Pharaoh, and he interprets the dream of the Pharaoh, and that results in him being elevated to the number 2 man in all of Egypt, because he's the man with the plan, and the plan is to save Egypt by some strict rationing, and Joseph is commissioned to carry out that plan. And that famine causes the brothers of Joseph now to have to come from Canaan to Egypt seeking food, because that's the only place where food is. And they come before Joseph, and Joseph recognizes them, but they do not recognize him. And so he puts a plan into motion, and he accuses them of being spies. And they say, no, we're not. We have a brother back home in Canaan and a father, and we're not spies at all. And in order to prove it, that they're not spies, he demands that they go back home. He keeps one of them captive. He keeps Simeon. I remember Simeon and Levi had been the 2 hotheads who had gone and killed everybody in Shechem in an earlier narrative. And so the other brothers are released. They're told, go back home to Canaan and bring their youngest brother, Benjamin. Benjamin is Joseph's fullest brother. Bring him now back to Egypt. And what Joseph is doing, he's seeking to reunite all of his brothers and see if they still have hatred, not just for him because they don't even know that he's still alive, but if they have hatred for his younger brother, for Benjamin, for the one for whom Jacob is showing partiality. And at the end of the day, the brothers, and particularly Judah, will pass the test of love. It was Judah who had come up with a plan to sell Joseph as a slave. And now it's going to be Judah who, when Benjamin is threatened, Judah will offer himself in Benjamin's place. What Joseph is doing, Joseph is manipulating his brothers in order to bring the family back together, not just physically, but spiritually. And as Moses writes this narrative, God is doing the same thing to Israel. He's taking them into a wilderness place and putting them through a period of testing to see if they will follow him, that they might be one. And that brings us to the question, what is God doing in your life to bring you closer to himself? As Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers, the refrain in that section, Genesis chapter 45, verse 5, Joseph says, God sent me before you to preserve life. Chapter 45, verse 7, God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. If Joseph hadn't gone to Egypt, all of the Israelites who had been in Canaan would have starved to death. In chapter 45, verse 8, it was not you who sent me here, but God. And so the brothers are reunited, and word goes back to Jacob that the rest of the family is all welcome, and they move down to Egypt. And just as Joseph had gone before the Pharaoh with a plan to save Egypt, now he goes before the Pharaoh with a plan to save his family, the family of Israel, and they are given a part of land in the eastern side of Egypt, on the eastern side of the Nile Delta, and here they will stay and settle this land of Goshen. The next thing that we read about in chapter 47 is how Joseph's policies are going to enslave Egypt. Here's the one who'd come to as a slave to Egypt, and here's the one who ends up being the cause of Egyptian enslavement. Genesis chapter 47 verse 10 says, "So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for every Egyptian sold his field." They had already sold their animals. Now they sold their field because the famine was severe upon them. Thus the land became Pharaoh's. Chapter 47 verse 25. "So they said, 'You have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord, and we will be the Pharaoh's slaves.'" Meanwhile, Israel comes into the land, and we read chapter 47 verse 27. "Now Israel lived in the land of Egypt in Goshen, and they acquired property in it and were fruitful and became very numerous, so that the Egyptians become slaves, whereas the Israelites become settlers in the land." And that's all under the rulership of Joseph. Now the story goes on to take us to a second interlude. Remember, we had an interlude with Judah and Tamar, and he signified as leader. Here again in this interlude, it's a series of blessings, and all of the sons of Israel are blessed. Sometimes it's not so much a blessing. Sometimes it's more of a prophecy and sort of a backhanded prophecy at that. But when we get to Judah, we're going to see him blessed as ruler. And then finally we'll come full circle, where instead of Joseph's brothers hating him, they'll be fearing him. But we'll get to that in a bit. First I want to talk about the blessing of Joseph's sons as he brings his sons Ephraim and Manasseh before Jacob. And Jacob is going to give a blessing, and Joseph has carefully arranged who is where, so that the oldest will be the recipient of Jacob's right hand, and the youngest will be the recipient of his left hand. And Jacob crosses his arms, much to Joseph's chagrin. Joseph says, "No, you're doing it wrong, Dad." And Jacob says, "No, I'm doing it right." Jacob was in touch with the fact that so often throughout the book of Genesis, God, out of grace, blessed not the deserving, not the older brother, but the younger brother. And Jacob does the same thing here by giving the greater blessing to the younger Ephraim and the other blessing upon Manasseh. Hebrews chapter 11, when in that faith chapter, the one thing that's mentioned about Jacob in that entire chapter is not his vision of the ladder to heaven, is not his wrestling with the angel, is not his bargaining with Laban. It's none of those things. Instead, we read Hebrews chapter 11, verse 21. "By faith Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff." It's as if finally, at this point of his life, Jacob finally gets it. He finally comes to terms with grace, and he passes that legacy on to his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren. Genesis 49, 1 and 2, "Then Jacob summoned his sons and said, 'Assemble yourselves, that I may tell you what will befall you in the days to come.' Here is Jacob as prophet. 'Gather together and hear, O sons of Jacob, and listen to Israel your father.'" And we're not going to go through all of those prophecies, but we ought to spotlight one. The one we need to spotlight is Judah. Genesis 49, verses 8 and following. "Judah, your brothers shall," there's a play on words there, "Judah, your brothers shall Judah you," because that's what the word Judah means, "shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down to you. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He couches, he lies down as a lion, and as a lion, who dares rouse him up? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. Now notice the scepter is the same thing as the ruler's staff. So we have this parallel language that it won't depart from between his feet. And that's an interesting way of describing it, because sometimes you talk about uncovering your feet. When you do that, you're talking about something of a sexual nature. You say feet instead of a little bit higher up on the legs. And the reference here might be talking about not just Judah's feet, but Judah's seed. That there will come a time when Judah's descendant will be king. And notice the scepter won't depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes. Shiloh sounds a little bit like shalom, peace. Until that peace comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. There's one coming who's going to be the king, and he will bring lasting peace and obedience. And of course, we look at King David, yes, but I think we're to look at the greater than David, greater than Solomon. I think we're to look at King Jesus. We come to chapter 50, and this is where Jacob has finally died, and there are burial arrangements made for him. He will not be buried in Egypt. Instead, Joseph goes to the Pharaoh, and he asks and receives permission to take Jacob, Israel, that's his other name, to take Jacob/Israel back to the land of Canaan. And so Jacob is returned to Canaan, where he is interred, where he is buried, back in the same tomb in Hebron, where Abraham and Sarah had been buried. And so they mourn over Jacob, and when that mourning is complete, he is buried, and we're told in detail about all of this taking place. And now there is another petition, but this time it is the brothers of Jacob coming to petition, or the brothers of Joseph coming to petition Joseph that they might be spared, because they're worried now that Jacob has died, maybe Joseph will now take vengeance upon them. And that's not going to happen. Instead, we're going to see the burial arrangements and death of Joseph. But we need to back up and look at verse 20. Genesis chapter 50, verses 19 and 20. But Joseph said to them, this is after their petition, after they're saying, have mercy upon us. He says, do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. God planned all that had taken place. Now, that doesn't mean that what they did wasn't wrong. They were using their own free will, but God's will was bigger than that, and God's will was using their evil decisions to bring about His perfect will to preserve many people alive. And then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear. This is right at the end of the book. He made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely take care of you, and you shall carry my bones up from here. So Joseph died at the age of 110 years, and he was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. So the book of Genesis begins, creation of heavens and the earth. It ends with a dead man in a coffin in Egypt. But they have a promise. They have a promise they're eventually going to go back to the land. And Joseph says, when you do that, you take my bones with you. You don't leave me here in Egypt. It may take 400 years, but you leave Egypt and you take my bones and you bury me in the promised land. Now there's a contrast that we ought to notice in closing. A contrast between Joseph in the Old Testament and Jesus in the New Testament. Joseph was the beloved of his father. Jesus is the beloved of the Father. Remember how the Father at his baptism says, this is my beloved Son. In Joseph's case, he wore a coat of many colors. You might translate that a coat with sleeves. In Jesus' case, his throne is is encircled by a rainbow of many colors. In Joseph's case, he was a shepherd. In Jesus' case, he is the good shepherd. Joseph was hated by his brothers, and they plotted to murder him. Jesus was rejected by his brothers. He came to his own, and his own received him not. His fellow Jewish people tried to murder him. Joseph was stripped of his tunic. Jesus was stripped of his robe. Joseph, his tunic was dipped in blood in order to deceive his father, Jacob. Jesus is described in the New Testament wearing a robe that is dipped in blood for us. Joseph was thrown into a pit. Jesus was placed in a tomb. Joseph was sold for 20 shekels of silver by Judah. We already noted that Jesus was sold. He was betrayed for 30 pieces of silver by Judas Iscariot. Joseph is raised in the story to become second in charge to Potiphar. Jesus is raised to the right hand of the Father. Joseph falsely accused by Potiphar's wife. Jesus falsely accused by the religious authorities. Joseph was imprisoned with two men. One was killed and one ended up in the palace with him. Jesus was crucified on the cross between two men. One then ends up dead and punished, and the other ends up, yes, he died, but he ends up with Jesus in heaven. Joseph, in his case, the Pharaoh saw the Spirit of God was upon him. And John the Baptist, you remember, saw the Spirit of God come down and abide upon Jesus. Joseph sees the Pharaoh telling his servants to do whatever Joseph tells them to do. And both Mary tells the servants, remember at the wedding feast of Cana, do whatever Jesus tells them to do. But I think maybe a better comparison is where at the Mount of Transfiguration, God says, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." In the Joseph story, we have the triumphal entry where Joseph is raised to be the number 2 man of all of Egypt, and they all exclaim, "Make way." And in the Jesus story, there's also a triumphal entry where all exclaim, "Hosanna, save, O Lord." In the Joseph story, everyone bows the knee before him, and there's coming a day where every knee will bow to Jesus. In the Joseph story, he has a feast with his brothers. We're invited to a feast. He prepares the Lord's Supper with his brethren, but we're also invited to that table. In the Joseph story, he tells his brothers not to be troubled. Jesus tells his brothers, his disciples, let not their hearts be troubled. They believe in God, believe also in him. In the Joseph story, he gave his brothers bread without a cost. And Jesus does the same thing. He gives us heavenly bread without a cost. In the Joseph story, he sends for his family and brings them to dwell with him. And Jesus came to save the lost and to bring us to dwell with him. God sent Joseph to go ahead and prepare a place for them. And Jesus said, "I'm going to prepare a place for you."